Real eSavvy Radio, your guide to more informed home ownership. Today, Christopher Cox is joined by Dr. Kenya Dennis on the debut show to talk about what Real eSavvy Radio and the website realesavvy.com is all about and how you can connect. Then, Christopher talks with the CEO of the Winston-Salem Urban League, James Perry, about home ownership in Winston-Salem. Let's get started.
I'm Dr. Kenya Dennis, sociologist and criminologist, and this is Mr. Christopher Cox of Real eSavvy. So, to get us started, Christopher, where are you from originally?
Originally, a little town outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, called Stilton.
Okay, so Stilton. And what brought you to North Carolina?
My family is originally from North Carolina, on both sides, maternal and paternal grandparents, great-grandparents are from Surry County.
Okay, Surry County. So it's interesting because when I ask you about why you started Real eSavvy, there could be some connections to where you're from, right, and your family. So what motivated you to start Real eSavvy?
Well, the long history of Real eSavvy was back in 1995, 96. And I first came home from school, didn't graduate. I was doing an internship in the House of Representatives. I fell in love with writing editorials and started writing editorials about economic development in central Pennsylvania. And it kind of grew to doing a talk show in Philadelphia. What I found in my mid-20s moving to Philadelphia was that most of my friends had a lot of the similar questions, young African-American professionals. I thought that moving from a small town of Stilton and Harrisburg, central Pennsylvania, moving to Philadelphia, that and the diversity of my friend base would eliminate some of those questions that didn't. I mean, we similarly have a lot of the same questions. How do I start going through this process? Are there grants available? And it kind of inspired me to try to research and put that information into a centralized format. And as technology evolved and eventually moving to North Carolina, I saw it, the opportunities manifest itself to do it again, like right here at WTOV. Surry County, maternal and paternal great-grandparents were slaves, freed slaves. So it makes me feel real good to have the opportunity to put this together here.
Okay, and it's very appreciated and much needed, as you know already, right? Your website has a lot of good information on there. Have you been able to encourage people to check out your website?
I've been pushing it out in the whole vision of the relaunch of Real eSavvy and putting it on completely online. But so that it could be very easily social network, because that's the platform that people pay attention to.
Yeah, so let's say somebody is apprehensive and they're not quite certain if they should even consider home ownership. Maybe they come from a background where people do not own property. How would you persuade them to at least research and consider it?
Every community across the country has housing counseling agencies. Most of they can be researched through that states, like for here, North Carolina Housing Finance Agency, Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency. On those websites will list certified housing counseling agencies that will typically have first-time home buyer programs or at least resources to direct people in the appropriate direction.
Okay, good. So with that in mind, do you do collaborations with other organizations and companies?
Not as of right now. I have in the past, and I have worked and maintained a relationship with the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency. So I kind of, have an idea, a really strong background and relationships there, and try to develop them here in North Carolina. But I guess they'll come up really soon here with Real eSavvy going out over the airwaves.
That's right, and we're excited to have Real eSavvy on the airwaves. So what would you do if you had to meet with some local organizations to talk to them about Really Savvy, what would you say?
You're actually really good at this. Like, I feel like
I know.
I'm supposed to be the host, and this is like.
Well, you told me to ask you questions.
Okay.
Well, you can ask me questions, but you told me to ask you questions.
Okay.
You want to ask me questions?
I do.
Okay.
Give me a second. Let me answer your last one, because I haven't been put in that position yet, and this is a lot as far as but been really putting in a lot of work to get everything up
That's
and
right.
running, and trying to facilitate an atmosphere that I can get people on the air, hopefully from some of those local organizations, and have those type of conversations a lot so that people can interact with you.
Yeah. So people are going to see you everywhere with your card and hear you talking about your wonderful website and everything.
Here it goes.
That's right. So look forward to seeing you.
ReallySavvy.com.
ReallySavvy.com.
Yeah.
You want to ask me some questions?
Yeah, I do. How long have you been in Winston-Salem?
I've been here for almost 8 years. I moved here in 2010 to be faculty at Salem College in the Department of Sociology. And I'm the criminologist, so I created the Criminal Studies program in 2011, and I'm the coordinator of the program still.
That's very impressive.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you approve.
Yeah. Where did you get your education?
Okay, so I'm from Richmond, Virginia. So originally went to University of Richmond for undergrad, political science. Graduated in 1999. Then I went to VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, graduated in 2003. But I had already started my doctorate at NC State in 2002. So I finished that in 2010. So that's my education, but I do a lot of community work.
That's
a
how I
lot of
met you.
presentation. That's how you met me.
Right. And this is and you just said it went really structured, the education process. I teased you once, and I'm gonna bring that back up now, so I could tell both your parents went to college. So
Oh, they're actually both professors, yeah.
it shows. It's a good look.
Really? Well, we were raised in a household where my three brothers and I, we were forced to learn and to have opinions, but also be able to have grounded opinions. Where if you're having a good, fun debate, it has to be more than, that's just what I think. Deal with it. So we were raised watching Tony Brown's Journal. Of course, we were raised playing video games. Mortal Kombat's my favorite video game. But we had to balance it.
You think you can beat me?
I know I can beat you in Mortal Kombat. It did.
We'll do that later. But
It did, sorry.
you can clip this, I'm sure. Yeah. Okay.
Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, Contra, you know. If you play me, be the end of your days or something. So we were raised in a very balanced household. Not a perfect household, like any family, of course, but we were raised to learn and to not fall for any kind of game that tries to portray us as being of African descent and therefore not knowing.
Talk to me about your study, because you have a big thing going on right now.
Yeah, so my work focuses on mental health, suicide, self-harm, gender, law enforcement, and all these different issues, including reproductive rights. And right now I'm working on research to reach Black, African American, and African heritage men, locally, nationally, and internationally, so they can speak with me about their emotions, their experiences, their opinions on topics. You know, I appreciate strong opinions. And this is a space where men can be free to discuss in a non-judgmental environment where I just, for a change, listen.
Yeah.
And it's information where it's confidential, so your name is not used. You get a respondent number. And I do presentations at barbershops if I'm invited, hair salons, religious institutions, anywhere where people respect research, Black woman research. I'm there.
Okay. So how can someone get in touch with you if they wanted to participate in the study?
Yeah.
I'll let you answer that one first.
Okay. Well, my website is www.kimyadennis.com. So that's kimyadennis.com. And my email address, which is also on the website, is Kimya, Kimya, at kimyadennis.com. So you can drop me an email. Also, my mobile number is 919-710-0288. You can call me and I'll send informed consent forms and information, and we can do phone interviews, however people want to do it. It has to be in a safe environment where people can share their information without feeling judged.
And I'm going to ask what everybody goes through everybody's name when they're asked to participate in that kind of study. What happens to the information? What is your ultimate goal with the information that you discern?
So first, I have a confidential person transcribe all interviews without any names added to the interviews, and I present them at community events, at conferences, and eventually I do publications. So I do a lot of public writing. So I'm a monthly contributor to Mental Health America of Virginia in different places where people want voices, because we know the general public does not read research. So a lot of people say, why don't you just publish a manuscript? And I do work on that, but I also want to reach the general public that will not read a journal article, but instead people want to see things in newspapers a lot of times, or magazines. So that's what I primarily focus on, and eventually I do write manuscripts of publication in publishers and journals.
Well, I appreciate you stopping by today.
Thank you.
Even though you kind of took over my show.
You come answer questions. So let's pontificate on this though. So
Okay.
Real East Savvy is very important, very needed, right? And I do work on Black men. What is the connection with what you do and Black men? Do many Black men think that they can realistically own a home?
That's a question that would be directed to you. I'm not a researcher. I do not have those type of numbers, Dr. Dennis.
You have to be a researcher to do the wonderful things you do. You just have
But I would just say in
Yeah.
general, and as you would know, the obvious things that stand out, that as single African American men, we don't typically seem to be. And I feel really bad saying this because I can't say, well, a certain percentage and this is the,
You don't have to.
but
That's okay.
are less likely to be homeowners as opposed to single African American women.
And single meaning what?
Not married.
Okay. All right. So it's like the census data single.
You're right.
Okay. So the work I also do includes expanding our definitions. So instead of saying single, maybe just saying unmarried, because some people do have life partners, right?
Okay.
And that can also shape whether they want to own a house. Or some people just don't want that finality. They're like, I don't want to pay a mortgage. I'm going to keep paying rent because I can go as I please, right?
Okay.
That's something.
And we talked about that. James Perry and I talked about that in the interview that airs in this my first episode of Really Savvy, and consumer confidence, and what that actually means, especially in this political, economic state that we're living in America in right now.
So what do you say to encourage people to have at least a little bit of consumer confidence?
As I talk to friends, not through the website, just keeping the information out as current as it comes up in the news, and making sure that it gets on the website, encouraging people to make the that kind of information gathering part of their lifestyle, and that's what I hope Really Savvy does. I mean, as I did, my initial thought was to relaunch a magazine and print and insert it in the African American newspapers. But the evolution of technology makes it easier to stay in somebody's face. If it's on Facebook, it makes it, as opposed to somebody going out and picking something up and reading it. You can get a lot done on Facebook. We have a president that went off Twitter.
I'm not going to talk about that with you. This is already something that's glaring in my eyes. So what do you think about doing a newsletter?
A newsletter. Well,
on your website, so people can sign up for maybe every month or every 2 months.
There is. There's a space on reallysavvy.com where someone can put in their information, get email updates as information changes, and as the radio show launches, the radio show will be embedded into the website, so that somebody can go back and say, hey, there was a show that I think I can glean some information from that ran a month ago. It'll be on there.
Awesome. Well, it's wonderful to speak with you about reallysavvy.com, and you go to the newsletter, which I thought I'd already signed up for the newsletter, but maybe I need to try that again. But you need to sign up for the newsletter, get some wonderful information from Christopher Cox.
It's a pleasure.
Real E-Savvy Radio continues with Christopher Cox and James Perry, CEO of the Winston-Salem Urban League, and a conversation about the home ownership challenges in Winston-Salem.
So thank you for your time and taking time out on a Friday evening. It's a little wet out, so they didn't, break up any plans or the backup plan.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, sir. So, just the CEO of the Winston-Salem Urban League, and let me introduce you, James Perry, and introduce yourself because you have, on top of being the CEO of the Urban League, a lot of experiences that drew me to want to have you as a guest related to housing.
Yeah. Well, yes, I do serve as CEO here at the Winston-Salem Urban League, but before that, I did a lot of work in housing. I ran the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center for 10 years. And of course, that was a situation where we did a lot of litigation, particularly work related to Hurricane Katrina. And so, I have a lot of concerns about housing, and then I'm always advocating for more affordable housing opportunities for folks in the community.
Okay. So you referenced Katrina, and that took everything I have on my tablet to a different direction for a moment. Mm-hmm. And our current situations in Houston, mm-hmm. and Puerto Rico, which is Florida. Mm-hmm. Have you kept up with that?
I have. So the organization that I ran in New Orleans was a sleepy, quiet organization, and 8 months after I took over it, Hurricane Katrina hit. And, I was brought in to do a turnaround of this small organization with 4 staff members. And Katrina wipes out, Katrina misses the city of New Orleans, and the federal levees, the infrastructure fails, and of course the city floods with water. And so all of a sudden, this small, tiny nonprofit organization has to rise to the challenge. And so of course we do. And it means that instead of taking on these individual one-by-one cases of housing discrimination, we began looking at large systemic issues. It took us on a whirlwind ride where we litigated literally hundreds of millions of dollars worth of litigation, and where I ended up testifying before Congress 8 different times. So now, when there's a hurricane and housing has to be rebuilt, I'm one of the folks that people end up calling. And not only that, we have a network of people who work together to make sure that people who are affected in all communities around the nation don't have to go through what we did in New Orleans. So when Superstorm Sandy hit in New Jersey and New York, we immediately got on the phone with our friends in those communities. And so the same thing for Harvey in Houston and in Puerto Rico, and now Hurricane Nate affecting Mississippi. So from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I can go on and on and on with the list of national organizations that we partner with. But the bottom line is that we get on the phone immediately and make sure that we build a network of support around the local organizations in those communities. And we say, look, here are the opportunities, here are the challenges, and we are prepared to assist you as you navigate this very difficult rebuilding process, and here's what you have to be ready for.
Now, how do you give advice to Puerto Rico being an island and the political structure, to put it as narrowly as possible, that will, how does that work? How can those organizations be supportive of your efforts?
Well, so here's the thing, is that in some ways it is not very different from what we faced in New Orleans. So you had a storm that hit or affected a very large number of communities, right? So Hurricane Katrina affected Texas, it affected Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida. And then shortly afterwards was another hurricane that affected many of those communities. And what we saw was that the allocation of federal resources was unfair, and that in communities that were disproportionately African American or Latino, and then also that happened to be poor, they didn't get sufficient federal funding. And it was clear to us that under certain federal laws, that was illegal. So one of the big concerns that I have certainly right now is that there seems to be a lot of attention for some communities that are not majority Latino communities, but there's a lot of difficulty when Puerto Rico wants to make its case and say, look, we have people who are dying, we have people who don't have clean drinking water, and we're not seeing enough support for rebuilding our infrastructure. What's going on here? What's the difference? And why was it so easy for people to reach out to some other communities? So it's not that hard to communicate that, and frankly, we don't have to communicate it. I think Puerto Rico sees it, and if anything, our job is to make sure that advocates in Puerto Rico don't have to build the case from scratch. Instead, we can say, look, here's the body of litigation, and here's the case that you make in order to be successful in this effort. That you don't, and you have friends and partners who are ready to stand by you.
Keeping my audience really savvy and moving in the bad circumstances. Somebody has an accident, and you're talking. You see me. I'm writing down stuff. Yeah. Documentation in emergency that somebody should keep, and all those things that you're saying, and making sure that they have their hands ready for, get their hands on quick.
Yeah.
What would you recommend?
Yeah, that's a great point, because in the end, when we're thinking about folks being savvy, and you're thinking about what happens when a storm hits, when Katrina hit, no one was savvy. None of us were really ready. We thought we were, but we weren't. And so I'm going to put this in two different buckets. The first bucket is, what do you need to have ready? And the second one is, what do you want to have ready? So in terms of what you need, none of us had our mortgage papers ready. And so when you call the mortgage company to talk about your mortgage and how to deal with it, because you might not be able to go back to your job if you can't go back into the city. So the mortgage company may have a program to let you delay mortgage payments. But if you can't tell them what your mortgage number is, or get in contact with them because you don't know the phone number, then you can't get into that program. So you need to have a copy of all of your mortgage information. If your house has been destroyed, then you want to communicate with your insurance company. But I couldn't tell you 10 days after Hurricane Katrina who my insurance company was. And so I couldn't look up the name of the company.
You were there actually during the storm?
My family was lucky in that we left literally as the storm was hitting. We convinced our last family member to get into the caravan and drive out, and the storm was bearing down as we narrowly escaped by driving, and all the roads were closed. So we drove towards the storm and drove literally at it, and then made a last-minute turn northward and were able to get away from it. But so we were sitting. I was sitting in Alabama at that point and trying to figure out who my insurance company was, and I had no clue. And so it took me about a month before I could make an insurance claim, because that's how long it took before I could get into the city and get to the house. And I was lucky enough to be able to find paperwork, despite the fact that the house was in terrible shape, and file a claim. So all the information about your house, from insurance paperwork, mortgage paperwork, your tax information, on and on and on, you need that information. And then you also need to be able to basically prove who you are, right? So there's this basic information like your birth certificate, your Social Security card, all of that basic information. You need to have that information ready to go, so that if you evacuate or you have to leave, you can grab it and go. Separate from that is that none of us realized that there's some things that are replaceable and some things that are irreplaceable, like family photographs. So there are some family photographs for our family that are just absolutely gone. Great-grandparents, grandparents, family graduations, gone, because none of us really fully thought about what happens in a storm like this. And so sometimes we said, we'll put it in the attic. Well, if your house gets completely knocked down and then floats down the street, then the attic isn't good enough, right? So there's some things that you just have to take with you if you're going to evacuate. And so there is this separate list of things that aren't necessarily needed because of an insurance claim or this kind of or being a savvy homeowner, but they're just about being savvy in life because you want your memories.
Right.
So.
Right. That's excellent, because that was even my intent to talk to you about. But I think it's great information for people to have in light of current national situations. which you recently released the State of Black Winston, and from a national perspective, first, then getting back to Winston. And anytime I ask national, look at that CNN every day, I'm just gonna say what's up and let my guests roll with me.
Yeah, well, the National Urban League has been a pioneer in many different ways, but one of the amazing things that they began doing decades ago was to quantify the challenges that the African American community faces, and so the way that they did that was through the State of Black America, and so they were able to look at several different categories: education, housing, employment, the way that African Americans end up engaging with the criminal justice system, and determine what is the state of black people in America. And so what it does, and what it's done over these decades, is to give us a baseline to know whether or not we're actually making any progress, And so in some categories, we're seeing some success, especially, for instance, in education. But sometimes we see success and then we see ourselves falling back. And it's important to know, because sometimes, for instance, rhetoric will make us feel like things are getting worse when they're not, or better when they're not. But data is really helpful to let us know where things really are. And it's particularly important at this time, when I think people are really frustrated after having the first African-American president, and now having a president whose rhetoric can be really frustrating.
And I think it has affected consumer confidence. When you look at all the mortgage numbers like this, the numbers are going up on one group, and numbers are going down. It's confidence level.
Yeah, if anything, the biggest challenge when it comes to President Trump is predictability. Other presidents, both Democrat and Republican, have, for the most part, in our lifetimes, been pretty measured in their comments and in their actions, unless there's been a disaster. But no matter where you fall politically in your beliefs, everyone has to agree that Trump is worst case, unpredictable, best case, pretty iterative in the way that he leads. So you just don't know if rates are going to go up or go down. You just don't know if this really is the best time to buy or the worst time to buy. You really don't know, and that makes it really hard to figure out what you want to do. But there are some core presumptions. One is that he is on the side of business, and if that's the case, it usually means that he's going to make it easier for business to for mortgage companies to operate and for insurance companies to operate, which will presumably loosen opportunities for people to buy homes. And
but what does that mean? Because on the one side, being in favor of banks means letting the rates go up and raising the value of the banking institution itself.
Well, that's my point. Is that can play out a lot of different ways, right? And so as a fair housing advocate, one of the arguments that we've made for many years is that the crash of the housing market that ultimately brought down the entire American economy was all about deregulation, and deregulation that folks thought was going to make the housing industry more profitable. In the end, it didn't. For a short period, it made the housing industry more profitable
because it was propped up.
Right, but that's right. So it's hard to say whether or not these policies are going to be helpful or hurtful. And the one thing that I do know for sure is that in the short term that he's been president, he hasn't had much time to focus on housing or on banking or on any of those issues, and so as a result, we just haven't seen very much change in policies or activities, and so the industry isn't that different from what we saw in the last administration. And so I think we have to give it some time before we know what a Trump housing policy really looks like.
I don't know if the Dodd-Frank was. I think it took African American loan officers off the street, because it stepped up into a game. Example, myself. Mm-hmm. I went through 3 layoffs in 07, 08. They had investment properties, watch credit, have issues. Dodd-Frank hit. Their check, it's a credit process. It's a very intense process. Yeah. And I think I haven't seen numbers, but I am confident that the number of African American loan officers that are out there interacting with communities and getting loans and marketing themselves within communities hurts. The other thing that I was going to say is that, do you think that interest rates are that strong of a predictor for the community at large? Come back to Winston, state of Winston, the state of Black Winston, housing specifically. Do you think it is that the community is buying homes based on the interest rate or based on need and opportunity? And then that affects, those numbers.
Yeah, those are 2 really interesting points. So, on the first point, I think that you're right. And this is conjecture. Unfortunately, neither one of us has had the opportunity to look at data. But my bet would be that there was a reduction in the number of African American and Latino loan officers. But conversely, there was this policy of reverse redlining that we saw, and in one of the problems, one of the challenges, and I want to be clear that the vast majority, at least in my experience, of African American and Latino loan officers were in the business of doing the right thing, of making quality loans, but there were a lot of circumstances where unscrupulous lenders were purposefully hiring loan officers who looked like the communities where they were making loans, and then using that advantage to take advantage of those communities and strip equity. So the moment that a regulation comes into play that makes it more difficult for an unscrupulous lender to strip equity, then of course they no longer have a need for a loan officer that looks like the people in that community, and so they pretty quickly drop that loan officer. That's a precarious circumstance, because what we want is, of course, more job opportunities for African American and Latino lenders, but we want them for lenders who are going to make high quality loans, and we don't want them to have those opportunities only to make loans in African American and Latino neighborhoods. We want them for lenders for all types of loans, right? So that's I think a larger industry challenge that needs to be addressed. To the second point of the role of interest rates, in an interesting way, I think that interest rates do drive home ownership opportunities, and not so much because every single purchaser goes out and shops for a great interest rate, but instead, what happens is that it drives how banks interact with consumers, and so the moment that interest rates get really low, banks begin advertising more aggressively, and I think more so than trying to convince homeowners to buy new homes. Instead, they go to homeowners who already own and say, "Will you refinance?" and they try to convince folks to take out new loans on properties that they already own. And so it does increase activity in the lending market, and it increases different kinds of activity, and it's not based exclusively on the savviness of a homeowner or on some consumer, but rather it's really based on the way that lenders say, oh, well, here's a great opportunity and I'm going to take advantage of it, or I'm going to push the consumers in our market to take advantage of it.
You've seen, as an attorney, a lot of big problems with the banks where they have to shell out a whole bunch of money. Have you seen that, quote unquote, trickle down into the community, into these and you just made me think as we're talking about these opportunities and trying to take advantage and becoming more savvy and taking advantage. Have you seen those loan products hit the street? And I won't name the banks, everybody knows them, it stays on the news, that have gotten big bills from the federal government. Where has that money gone? Big fines from the federal government.
I have, as a matter of fact. So, so in my former work, I was part of a case, and to be clear, I have a Juris Doctorate, but I don't practice. And but my organization and I were part of a case against Wells Fargo that settled, I think, for $32 million across several states. Somewhere between 8 and 10 different states. Certainly Louisiana was one of those states because I was in Louisiana at the time. And the vast majority of the funding actually went exclusively to set up a fund to repair the damage done or the harm inflicted by the discriminatory action. And so, in many of the cases that I've seen or that I know of, particularly where there's a fair housing element, the majority of the settlement funds are for the purpose of repairing the harm. And it is always a challenge to identify and to make sure that funding gets directly back to a particular consumer. And so sometimes the funding opportunity comes back to a neighborhood or a community, or as part of a fund to rebuild a community. But generally, I do see the funding opportunity come back to the community. If anything, I think the biggest challenge in holding any institution accountable, there are two. The first one is that oftentimes the fine, it pales in comparison to the amount of profit that a company will have made in that period of time. And if you can't structure the fine or the damage in litigation to make sure that it is sufficient as compared to the amount of profit that an institution is making, then it becomes simply the cost of doing business, which means that there's no problem to go ahead and do the same thing again. That's I think the biggest and most concerning issue. The second one is that there's rarely a way to ensure that the employees who engaged in or managed or ensured that harm happened. I've seen a number of cases where there wasn't language to ensure that those people were no longer at the company.
On a senior level. Bottom level, people always go first. I haven't seen any accountability after that time period. Taking it back, bringing it back to Winston, what are the numbers in the state of black housing?
Well, so it's funny, I was just looking at this today. The African Americans in Forsyth County own homes at 50% the rate that white residents do. Right? So that simply means that the home ownership rate is half, and and so the question becomes, well, what does that mean in a very practical sense? It means a few things. The first is that if you think about wealth, opportunity, or building economic opportunity for anyone or for your family, the main way that people do it is through home ownership, right? Through the ownership of property. And most folks who become millionaires through the ownership of property, or they'll use their property in order to start a business, and then the business is what helps them become a millionaire. But it all starts with ownership of property. So if African Americans only own property at half the rate of white residents, then they're half as likely to presumably have an opportunity to grow wealth. The second issue, though, and this is one that the report doesn't really get into, is that because Winston-Salem, like most communities, I mean, it's hard to find a community in America that doesn't have this problem. Winston-Salem is segregated, right? And the African-American neighborhoods in Winston-Salem tend to have a lower property value than majority white neighborhoods. So the homes that African-American residents own in Winston-Salem, if they tend to have a lower property value, it also means that for the African Americans who are able to achieve home ownership, when they do want to save and accrue value in that home and then use it in order to accrue wealth, it takes a longer time, or it's more difficult to do so because the homes are worth less. So this path of using home ownership in order to grow your wealth is a much more difficult and steep path because of the lower value of homes in African American neighborhoods. So unless African Americans, cross segregation lines, or unless white residents cross segregation lines, then you don't really get a chance to grow wealth as an African American resident at the same rate as white residents. The one other thing that affects this is that's also shown in the report is that African American residents in Forsyth County make 62 cents on the dollar when compared to white residents. So on average, if you're an African American resident and you want to go and buy a home, you can't afford as much home as a white resident, because one of the biggest factors in your ability to purchase a home is how much money you make. So if you only make 62 cents on the dollar as compared to a white resident, then you don't get to buy as much home, and of course that's part of why an African American resident affords less home and then doesn't build wealth at the same rate. So yeah, it is a big issue, and so part of the question for a really savvy homeowner or would-be homeowner is how do you overcome that problem, right? How do you how do you skip over that problem if you're at 62 cents on the dollar and still afford as much home as someone who was making a full dollar, right? So and that's the constant challenge that keeps probably both of us awake at night.
Right. Going back to value, what's the long-term strategy to equalize?
Yeah, so
equalize communities, and let me go back so I didn't lose anybody in that conversation. We're sitting across from each other and getting the value more comparable.
Yeah, so that's a very it's a very difficult question, and I think that for any person, scholar, lawyer, lender that you ask, they might give you a very different answer.
Because then you reach into issues of gentrification.
Right. So if you think about a prideful African American historic neighborhood, there are a lot of arguments against integrating that neighborhood. But on the flip side, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that the way that we get segregated neighborhoods is, I hear folks all the time when I bring up this issue of segregation, try to make a case to me that segregation is about people choosing to live in segregated neighborhoods. But segregation is by design, and in segregation comes from a system of laws and policies that have been in place since the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and that are still being promulgated. And so, when you add up the amount of money that has been invested in creating segregated communities, and then we think about the attempts to integrate communities, it is a 10-to-1 investment. And probably even worse than that, probably closer to a 25-to-1 investment. $25 an investment in creating segregation to a $1 investment in undoing segregation. And so, if we were serious about it, then the amount of investment that it would take would be a huge amount of investment, and that's really the first step in attempting to create it. And probably in repairing or fixing the issue of segregation so that communities are integrated is probably, oddly enough, as expensive as it would be, the easiest way. There's a community just outside of Chicago that prides itself as the only fully integrated community in the nation. And they work really hard to and constantly monitor how integrated their community is. And the name of that neighborhood is escaping me right now. But they really are one of few communities that are truly racially integrated. But for anyone who's listening or watching right now, if you ask them in their city, where's the black neighborhood, where's the poor neighborhood, where's the Asian neighborhood, where's the Latino neighborhood, they can name it. And it doesn't matter if they're in New York, California, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, depending upon where you are, you might add Native American or a few other ethnicities, but in the end, you can name these different neighborhoods because America is so segregated. And but so if you move beyond this issue of making communities integrated, the other solutions tend to be pretty dramatic.
Going back to banking and thinking about not promoting any particular bank, but I'd love to give a shout out if there's a mortgage program here in Winston that you've seen that's been effective in addressing some of the concerns that we talked about, lower down payment amounts, flexibility, and debt to income ratios. Then, and those programs obviously create and eliminate the problems that we're talking and help create opportunities.
Yeah, there's not a particular program just yet. I think
they come and go.
Yeah, I think that's true. The programs come and go. I think that this is a community that certainly is cognizant of its challenges. Highway 52 is a dividing line that is so obvious that it's hard to find someone who doesn't know about it and doesn't admit that it's a clear and difficult dividing line. And but what's much more difficult to find is someone who says, I know what to do about it, or here's what I'm doing about it. And so, so I think it's a significant challenge. The one bit of good news is that it's on people's minds.
Mm-hmm. So are there conversations about programs? Do you know that they're coming ahead of time?
I think that, but to your point, I think that they come and go, and I think that it is difficult to sustain the funding for those activities. And there is also just these are the first few years after the complete crash of the housing market. And so, one of the challenges I think that folks have run into is getting people to say, let's move on to this next issue, or get refocused on this issue of integrating communities, because a lot of lenders and people in the housing industry would just try to make sure that they were alive,
But we're watching banks get bigger. I mean, there's banks are still spreading out. So you quote my last article, the Community Reinvestment
That's where I was
Act,
going next. Yeah.
right? Isn't that playing a part, or has
Well,
that been affected?
The thing that the other thing that I was going to say is that one of the for the banks who for the people, the entities in the housing business who aren't just worried about staying alive, the impetus for them to stay focused on community investment and on integration really historically has been the Community Reinvestment Act. And going back to the role of the administration, there does seem to be a pretty clear communication from this administration that there's not going to be as much focus on the Community Reinvestment Act, and so while there's not been a clear regulation or rule put in place, I think that there is an overall sense that lenders don't have to worry so much about it. Here's the other thing: is that all of us, even folks who sincerely believe that the Community Reinvestment Act is a very important tool, know that lending has changed pretty dramatically, and that the business of banking has changed pretty dramatically. So that
not as much brick and mortar.
Yeah.
So they don't have, if a particular bank has a responsibility in a certain community based on their geographic branch location, if they're all internet.
That's right. That's the core issue. Is that more and more customers interact with their bank online, and if your employer does direct deposit, and if on the rare occasion that you get a check, a physical check, you simply are able to take a picture of that check and then throw your check away and never have to actually go to the bank. And then when you need cash, you can go to an ATM anywhere in the country. Then for 98% of your bank interactions, you may not go to a branch. So it does pretty heavily change the way that you interact with a bank, and it changes this presumption in the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, that a bank has to have a physical location in a neighborhood in order to interact with that neighborhood. It also means that a bigger part of making sure that a bank invests in the community is ensuring that community is able to cross the digital divide. And if the bank and that community can meet somewhere in the middle of the digital divide, then maybe we're able to do a better job of ensuring that folks are banked. So
that would have to happen legislatively, though, and nothing's really going down like that.
Well,
would it? I mean, wouldn't the act have to be amended to account for those?
So there's some aspects of the act that have to be amended. There are other aspects of the act that are regulatory. That can happen strictly through agency regulation, and so it's going to be interesting just to see what comes in the future, and I think that we'll see what happens in upcoming elections, but this is a moment where there are conservatives in the House, the Senate, and in the White House, and so
But I don't see our current president playing that much of a conservative role when all of his boys are on Wall Street. So I think that could go either way, if it's to the bank's benefit.
Either way, the point is...
Yeah, do you give a point? I don't see that, I don't necessarily equate that Wall Street rationale with mid-America conservatism.
Yeah, I get you, but my point either way is that so not much legislation has moved, period, during this.
And this is going to be the last thing that anybody thinks about in the current climate.
Yeah. So, but if some legislation, if there were going to be some change, that it's a thing to be concerned about.
Could it potentially be affected by any type of executive action?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that was my point about the fact that there's a lot of regulation.
Okay. All right. Well, I really want to thank you. I'm not going to use the whole hour. I'm trying to ease back into this. It's been a minute, and it's people like you. I'm not claiming to be a subject matter expert necessarily, but I've met a lot of good people that have access and have experiences that I think will help make everybody a little bit more real e-savvy.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
All right.
RealESavvy.com has resources to help you become more informed about home ownership. Visit the website and stay tuned for the next Real eSavvy radio broadcast with Christopher Cox every fourth Sunday at 9 a.m. Real eSavvy Radio is a production of RealESavvy.com and is produced through the facilities of Southern Broadcast Media, LLC.